Today is May the 4th, the day where every year, nerds everywhere affect a sudden lisp and start dropping Star Wars references. But if you want to talk about nerdy Star Wars references, you really need to step up your game if you ever hope to match the sheer dorkery of Square Enix's Final Fantasy series. Look, Star Wars happens pretty much everywhere in geek culture. It's kind of a lifeblood thing. But the Final Fantasy games have taken it to an incredible extreme through the years. The entire series sometimes feels like a giant Star Wars fanfiction. Final Fantasy may have started off as a giant Dungeons & Dragons ripoff back in 1987, but beginning with the sequel, you could tell the creative leads like Hironobu Sakaguchi and Akitoshi Kawazu decided they should cast their nerd net wider and pilfer from other sources. Final Fantasy II felt equally stolen from the Star Wars films and Hayao Miyazaki's Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind. Eventually Nausicaa's influence faded, but Star Wars remained. If anything, it's only become stronger over the years. And that's why we say, every Final Fantasy is actually Star Wars. Sure, evil empires are hardly unique in fiction, but they're the trademark of Star Wars, and they're a fixture of Final Fantasy too. The series' first empire from Final Fantasy II seemed to have more in common with the Torumekian kingdom from Nausicaa. But by the time we got to Final Fantasy VI, the Star Wars influence was unmistakable. Of course, Final Fantasy VI was the Star Warsiest of all Final Fantasies, but the part where the Emperor was thrown to his death by his right-hand man at the precise moment of his greatest triumph really drove home the fact that, yeah, these guys love them some Star Wars. Maybe this one's a little bit of a gimme, since the Force is basically magic, and as a fantasy RPG series, magic is Final Fantasy's stock and trade. But sometimes the connection is a little more obvious than others. There are the times where magic is a secret hereditary power, as with the summoners in Final Fantasy IX. There are the times when some unassuming kid in the boondocks aspires to be a hero and becomes swept up in a grand scheme and must learn to master his new powers, as with Cloud in Final Fantasy VII. And then there are the times that magic is the binding force of the universe that must be put into careful balance, as in Final Fantasy XII, which incidentally is the second Star Warsiest of all Final Fantasies. Star Wars would be nothing if not for the intimidating presence of its greatest on-screen villain, yeah, Darth Vader. There are three things that define Darth Vader. He wears cool samurai-inspired armor, he has the power to back up his looks, and he's actually the hero's father.
I am your father.
Well, Final Fantasy has that in spades. First, there was Final Fantasy IV's Golbez, who had the same dark armor thing going on, wielded infinitely more power than the heroes, and turned out to be protagonist Cecil's brother. Final Fantasy X gave us Sin, a primal force that lacked the rat armor, but more than made up for it with power, and, oh yeah, turned out to be Tidus' father.
Hit me with all you got, Dad!
And then there was Judge Gabranth of Final Fantasy XII, whose armor was pretty much a Darth Vader copyright infringement, who commanded extraordinary power, and who was actual main character Bosch's twin brother. You can't have a Vader without an Obi Wan, the elder statesman of the Force, destined to be turned into a ghost by his former apprentice turned evil. Final Fantasy IV had Tella, the aging wizard who destroyed himself in his zeal to destroy Golbez. Final Fantasy X had Auron, the ghost samurai who was best buds with Tidus' father Jek before Jek became Sin. And Final Fantasy XII, well, surprisingly it doesn't have an Obi Wan analog, but it is part of the same universe as Final Fantasy Tactics, which gave us the amazing Thunder God Cid, a powerful warrior with a white beard, brown robe, and unstoppable holy sword. Since Final Fantasy usually has you fighting goblins and behemoths instead of human shock troops, the series has actually been relatively low on bad guys who look like the Empire's white-clad legions. There's definitely a lot of that going on in Final Fantasy XIII though. Psycom forces are equally vast in numbers to stormtroopers, equally intimidating in their masked armor, and equally easy to put down, except of course when the story calls for them to show a sudden burst of competence. Not often a parallel to the wizened Jedi Master in Final Fantasy do you see. Perhaps Final Fantasy V's Sage Guido would be the closest thing to Yoda, an ancient green creature living in a cave whose humble form belies his power and knowledge. Either that or Final Fantasy VI's Mog, another diminutive cave dweller capable of controlling the very environment with his unique magical powers. Han Solo's towering Wookiee co-pilot, on the other hand, gets riffed on a lot. Physically, No Final Fantasy characters resembles Chewie as much as Final Fantasy VI's Yeti Berserker Umaro. On the other hand, Final Fantasy X's blue-furred Ronso warrior Kimahri not only looks the part, but he's also the most reliable and intimidating of Summoner Yuna's protectors on her pilgrimage. And of course, let's not forget Final Fantasy XII's Fran, who, as a barely dressed bunny woman, comes off as nothing so much as a Rule 63 version of Chewie. She's tall, brown, a great pilot, and weirdly loyal to the game's brazen Han Solo ripoff, the air pirate Balthier. Speaking of Han Solo, you can't forget about his battered hot rod of a spaceship, the Millennium Falcon. Airships have always been a mainstay of Final Fantasy, since the very beginning, but sometimes the Star Wars influence is more obvious than others. Like in Final Fantasy VI, where the airship actually is called the Falcon, and you end up winning it in a wager from the gambler Setzer, just like Solo won the Falcon fair and square from gambler Lando Calrissian. Final Fantasy doesn't deal much in androids, but you can still see analogs for Star Wars' Oddest Couple if you look hard enough. The odd friendship between artificial humanoid Vivi and priggish knight-errant Steiner in Final Fantasy IX, for example. But really, the truest counterparts to R2 and 3PO come in the form of Final Fantasy XII's Vaughn and Penelope. Yeah, they're kids rather than robots, but as outsiders swept into someone else's grand adventure, despite lacking any real importance to the plot, they provide the same grounded perspective into the story for viewers that Star Wars droids serve. And finally, just in case you think this is all a bunch of tenuous train spotting, consider Exhibit C, Biggs and Wedge. First appearing as a pair of Imperial soldiers in Final Fantasy VI, this recurring duo has made appearances in almost every Final Fantasy game of the past 20 years. And of course, they're named for two of Star Wars' supporting characters, Biggs Darklighter and Wedge Antilles. Final Fantasy VI's writers dug deep for that one, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that they're just as much Star Wars nerds as the rest of us. Of course, Final Fantasy is very different from Star Wars in many ways. It brings its own identity to the table. Consider Final Fantasy X-2, whose playable cast consists entirely of 3 tough-as-nails women. That's one more woman than has ever had more than 3 lines of dialogue in any Star Wars movie.